I pressed my hands to my mouth because when my daughter hit play, the courtroom went silent. The truth didn't just spill out. It destroyed everything he had been hiding. Click. A small, ordinary sound. It landed like a hammer. She hit play. The judge froze. My ex's face drained of color. The gallery inhaled as one, a single stunned breath that filled the room and held it there. For a second, time seemed to stall. The scrape of a pen paused. A phone stopped buzzing. A woman 2 rows back put her hand to her lips. Muffled sobs threaded through the hush like distant thunder. Years of lies unspooled in 10 minutes, small betrayals that had been whispered into late nights, the cold silences at the dinner table, the hidden accounts, the legal maneuvers meant to make me look unstable, all of it found its echo in those frames. This wasn't just evidence, it was the map of everything he'd tried to bury. His stories, his excuses, the neat little untruths that built up into a life that wasn't ours. I will not lie. The stakes were raw. Custody, reputation, a career he'd polished in public while he polished over the truth at home. He wanted to make me the angry one. He wanted me to look like the one who couldn't cope. He wanted us silenced. Instead, one small device in my daughter's unshaken hand folded that performance in front of everyone. If you've ever been backstabbed by those closest to you and fantasized about the perfect revenge like subscribe and comment your own story below, this one's going to hit hard. I remember the courtroom air, dry like paper, the varnish scent of the benches, the cold, indifferent light from high windows. I remember the remote, ordinary plastic weighty in her palm, and the way her fingers didn't tremble until after the first clip ended. I remember the sound of his voice in those recordings, softer than the man I'd lived with, smaller where it should have been large. I remember my own heart, loud in my ears, and a strange heavy relief that walked through me like a slow tide. You might think it all began in that moment under the judge's gaze, but it didn't begin that day. I remember the mornings like a film I could run with my eyes closed. The small, ordinary things that made up our life before the fissures appeared. The kettle hissed at 6. Steam fogged the window above the sink in perfect soft shapes. My daughter, Mia, would pad in her slippers, hair a tangle, already arguing about cereal choices as if the world would be saved by the right flakes. I would pour coffee and watch the tiny spirals lift from the cup, the bitter smell that kept me steady. The house smelled then of laundry detergent and something warmer, the faint musk of someone who lived here, who left socks in piles and coffee rings on the counter. "You'll be late for work," I said, because asking had become a ritual. She smiled. "I'll drop her at school." She never missed a beat. She was reliable like that. She was 15 and fierce and small, with knees scarred from a fall the summer she learned to skateboard. She kept her notebooks precise, her jokes dry, and she loved basil so much that she watered the plant like a pet. When she laughed, the sound folded through the rooms and made everything else lighter. We braided each other's hair on Sunday mornings and argued about the best playlist for homework. Those were our tiny anchors. He was a different kind of sound. In public, he was velvet, easy charm, a laugh that sounded practiced but warm, a hand on my shoulder at the right moment to steady me in front of colleagues. He smiled in photographs. He could disarm a stranger in 30 seconds. People liked him. He liked being liked. At fundraisers, he joked about how terrible he was at cooking, and strangers handed him recipes like they were confessions. At home, he was silence. The first time I noticed the gap, I thought it could be explained. There was a work trip, a late meeting. He came home and kissed Mia on the head and said he'd be out again that night. I watched him leave and counted the seconds before he was back. They stretched. He came in with a tired face and placed a folded newspaper on the table like a placating thing. He sat at the edge of the bed and scrolled on his phone. I asked him about dinner, and he said, "Don't make it a thing." He said it like a small law. I put the plates away and told myself I was tired. Small things built the pattern. A message that vanished if I asked about it. A drawer locked for work papers. A slightly harsher tone when I questioned plans. He called it space. I called it a closing door. I confronted him once, not with a dramatic speech, with a receipt. I had noticed a bank notification that didn't fit our calendar. A transfer, late at night, small enough to be unremarkable in a spreadsheet, but wrong because we counted pennies for a new winter coat. I printed the statement and folded it between cup and saucer like it might catch the steam. He glanced at it, and then he smiled the way men do when they need to reset the face. "It's all in your head," he said casually, as if the phrase had been waiting for a quiet room to be used. "You worry too much, you always have." He said it with kindness. That kindness was like a varnish over a splinter. Pretty, but it didn't stop the pain. Short sentence. Pain. When someone tells you you're imagining things, the room rearranges. Trust is not a thing you can recenter once it's been shifted. You look for the anchor you once trusted and find the line has been moved an inch. You try to step and misplace your foot. The house becomes a landscape of half-truths. Even with the gaslighting, even with the late texts I'd never see, there were still ordinary mornings where he read the newspaper out loud and corrected the crossword with an air of smugness. He could be incandescent in those small windows, telling Mia a ridiculous story about a meeting and making her snort laugh at the silly mimicry. It was confusing. It was maddening. The man I loved and the man who could, with such casual cruelty, make me doubt my senses were the same person in different clothes. By then, the financial little betrayals had crept into our lives. A small account I didn't know existed showed up on a bank alert. A card with a name I didn't recognize was on the bills tray. A late fee that meant he'd cut back on something without telling me. My gut tightened like a fist. I remember the afternoon I found the email. It was buried in a folder of work messages that he'd labeled in a way that suggested dryness. Tax, important, do not delete. The subject line said nothing. The preview line had a string of numbers. I clicked it and my vision narrowed. It was a contract. Signatures anonymous at first, then his name in a font I knew too well because I'd watched it sign grocery lists and permission slips. He had signed something without telling me. He'd moved money. He had opened accounts. There were references to securing interests and protecting reputations. Bureaucratic words that landed like anchors on our lives. I asked him about it that night. We stood in the kitchen while the kettle cooled. Mia was upstairs humming a song into the teeth of her phone. My hands shook. I set the printed contract on the counter like it was evidence at a crime scene. His face went blank in a way that frightened me because it was a practiced kind of blank. "It's work stuff," he said. "It's complicated." His voice was low, intended to reassure. He placed a hand on mine that felt foreign. "You don't need to worry about this. I'll handle it." I had held onto that line for a while. I let the worry sleep under other kinds of noise. I booked a dentist appointment. I made pancakes. I told myself that the legalese was ordinary. I told myself I was tired and that tiredness made me see threats where there were none. The pattern tightened. There were nights he came home smelling faintly of another cologne. Not a perfume you'd label as a lover's signature, but a scent that belonged in hotel rooms. He would change the subject when I asked. He would tell me I was being dramatic. He would fold his hands and remind me of the life we had built. He made me feel fragile. He was a sculptor of small doubts, and he chiseled away at my certainty. Mia began to notice. Teenagers have a radar for the things adults try to hide, like adults have a knack for making soup. She would sit at the kitchen table, tapping a pencil, head cocked, asking pointed questions with the innocence of a child and the accuracy of someone who had watched the Feuette the same time as me. The worst moments were the small, bright ones where the truth would press against us and then retreat. One night at bedtime, I read her a chapter from an old book we both loved. The house was a map of soft light, the lamp by her desk, the glow from the street, the moon fingering the curtains. She curled under the quilt, and I smoothed her hair. "Mom?" she asked, voice muffled against the pillow. "Yes?" "Do you think adults always tell the truth?" I told her as honestly as I could. "No. Sometimes grown-ups hide things, but we can always look for the truth." She grinned, a small, fierce flash. "Good, because I'm good at detective stuff." That was the moment I should have leaned in and asked everything. Instead, I kissed the top of her head and told her to sleep. She slept with a nightlight and a notepad beside her bed. She wrote things down, little facts, things people said, times of phone calls, names. The list looked at first like a teenager's diary. Later, the list would feel like evidence, and then the big shift. The first betrayal that could not be papered over by a vase of flowers or an apology. He filed something. I found the notice like you find a bruise on your arm, a small, undeniable mark that was not there before. The letter came on a weekday. It was stamped and official, the kind of paper that has a way of folding hours into a different shape. I tucked the mail into my apron pocket and tried to ignore the heaviness in my chest as if it were indigestion. When I read it, my vision tunneled because the words were clinical and precise. Petition for emergency measures, request for sole custody, allegations of instability. The letter used language designed to sound like protection while it functioned as a weapon. It said in bureaucratic satin that I was not safe. It said in black ink that he had painted me as a hazard to our child. Short sentence. I sat down. I rang him. He answered in under 3 rings. His voice was a practiced calm, the same voice he used when someone complimented him at a gala. "We got something," I said. "Oh?" He paused in a way that made me think he was stepping up from a couch, smoothing dress slacks. "What was it?" He sounded interested. He sounded innocent. He sounded as if he could not imagine my worry. "The letter, it's from your lawyer." Silence. A small, thin silence that had the weight of a withheld breath. "It's probably a precaution," he said finally. "We'll deal with it together. Don't worry." His words were a blanket thrown over an ember. They did not cool it. They only delayed the burn. The evening before the hearing, the one before the first procedural meeting, I was making a list of things I needed. Copies of Mia's school records, the calendar of trips he had taken, emails that hinted at his other life. I made coffee, and the rings on the counter looked like the stains of old disagreements, as if every cup had its memory. I flicked on Mia's laptop to print a file and found, between homework folders, a small flash drive. It was taped to the bottom of her pencil case. Mia appeared in the doorway, and I almost said nothing, but the sight of her small shoulders in a hoodie made me tongue-tied with relief and fear. "Where'd you get that?" I asked, holding the drive up. She opened the fridge and reached for an orange without looking at me. "Found it in the car, under the seat," she said, casual as a weather report. I turned the drive over. A strip of sticky notes stuck to it. Her handwriting sprawled. "Don't tell him, for later." Her hand had the same curve as the lines she wrote for her math homework, neat and decisive. My heart kicked. I asked, "Did you put this here?" She shrugged, biting the rind of the orange. "I didn't put it there on purpose. I just thought it was something we should keep. In case." "In case of what?" My voice betrayed me. It had become thin and raw. She tilted her head, eyes honest. "In case we need to prove things." She said it so quietly, so simply, like offering me a bandage. I don't like when people lie. Mia was 15. She had the clear-eyed justice of someone who still believed in fairness. She also had a propensity for saving little things. A voicemail here, a screenshot there. A voice memo of a call where a grown man's tone slipped in ways he thought no one would notice. She recorded the silly stuff. A joke here, him singing off-key in the car. Because she liked to tease him later. She kept it because she had a habit of keeping things that mattered. I slid the drive into my palm. It was warm from being in the car. Warm, like a secret. For the first time in months, the room rearranged into a possibility. Not a blind hope, but something like oxygen. It felt dangerous and good to think that maybe we had more than doubt. Maybe we had proof. But then the mail, with its thin spike of accusation, landed on the mat. The documents, the taped note, the folder of invoices I had printed, the phone calls. They were small threads. When I gathered them, they felt like a lifeline. But they also felt like tinder. Paper could burn, words could be misread, people could be convinced. That night, I lay awake and pictured the courtroom. I pictured the bench and the murmurs, the whisper of shoes on polished wood. I pictured Mia's fingers curled around the remote like she held it through thick fog. I pictured him, adjusting his tie, smiling as if the world had not shifted beneath him. I did not know then what the drive contained. I only knew the feeling of holding a thing that might save us, and the terror that it might be the first thing he used to tell the world I was the problem. A cliffhanger crouched at the end of the day like a cat on a windowsill. The next morning, when I opened the second envelope, thin, legal, stamped with a firm hand, there was a line that made my stomach drop. We will be seeking expedited relief. Underneath, his lawyer's name. A signature that I had seen only on dinner receipts and birthday cards now sat there in a font that felt final. Short sentence. Final. I turned the flash drive over in my fingers as if it were a coin I could toss to decide the future. Mia watched me in the doorway, sleepy-eyed, her hair escaping the knot at the back of her head. She said nothing. Her silence was not cluelessness. It was an offer of solidarity I had not earned but received anyway. This was the hinge. This was the moment that peeled back whatever naive trust had been left and let the machinery of law and reputation roll toward us. I thought of all the little truths we had gathered like pebbles, and I understood with a bone-deep certainty that those pebbles might be all we had to stop a force that could shape our lives with a single signature. But the first strike had already been made. And in the quiet between the kettle's hiss and the night's sighs, the house held its breath, waiting for the next sound. They began like a slow leak, just small signs at first, almost polite in their cruelty. The first notice arrived in an envelope stamped with a law firm I recognized from a charity gala where he'd shaken hands and smiled. The paper smelled faintly of printer toner and something metallic like new pens. My hands shook as I slid it open. Inside was a polite aggression, demand for expedited relief, a proposed temporary order, a calendar of hearings. The lawyer's name was there, crisp and confident, a practiced signature like a flourish. He had the kind of handwriting that told you he'd written it 100 times and never once worried how it landed on someone else's life. Within days, the tone changed. My phone buzzed with automated filings, then with a real voice. A woman in an office whose chair must have been high-backed and firm. "We've issued the motion," she said. Her words were efficient, practiced. She read legalese in a clipped rhythm. "We will be seeking temporary custody, pending hearing." I could hear the rustle of papers even through the line. The cold, fluorescent lights of that office flickered on my mind like an image I couldn't scrub. Hard light, no shadows, everything exposed. He had hired the real pros, not the small-town scrappers who sprinkled charm with promises. These were polished. They smelled faintly of aftershave and certainty. He let them speak. He let them be the armor. He stood behind them in interviews, an easy smile training the public gaze away from what was happening at home. He used charm like a shield. He let other people tell the story. He let them frame me. The first hearing was a mosaic of small humiliations masked as procedure. I sat beneath the judge's gaze in a dress I'd chosen because it felt neutral, because neutral felt safe. The courtroom air smelled of varnish and too strong coffee. I felt the hard curve of the wooden bench under my palms. My lawyer, new friend, a woman whose patience had its own quiet steel, took notes and whispered reminders. He sat across from me, lips a practiced line like a portrait of composed culpability. He looked like a man who could host dinners and be handed awards. He looked like the man people would believe. "You appear emotional," his attorney said at one point, in that way designed to be a diagnosis. The words were soft but surgical. "Her behavior appears unstable," he suggested to the record as if offering an expert observation. I felt the room tilt just a fraction, a dozen faces in the gallery rearranged to accommodate that suggestion. I was suddenly the problem to be managed. They filed motions that made sense only if you accepted their framing. They called it concern and protection. They called it caution. But the language had teeth: alleged instability, inconsistent parenting, concerns about mental health. I watched the papers as if they were animals I'd once fed and now could not stop them from circling my life. Every line was designed to make the judge picture me as an unstable mother who needed oversight. Every line was designed to tilt the scale. Outside, in the bright lobby of the courthouse, people unfurled small talk like paper napkins, and someone I used to count as a friend asked, a little too loudly, "Are you sure you're okay?" Her tone had a polite edge. It was as if she needed permission to be worried for me. Other people in our circle began to offer cautionary opinions in hushed texts that read like advice columns. Maybe make sure you have copies of everything. Maybe don't post so much. Maybe keep things calm. It was sympathy with a leash. It tinged like vinegar. Rumors have the weight of gravity. They don't shout, they fold, they gather and press. The neighborhood where we once traded cookies and borrowing sugar became a theater for small looks. At the park, a neighbor I'd waved to every morning stopped mid-hello and nodded to my daughter as if acknowledging a fact she didn't understand. "I heard," she said, and then, "I hope it works out." She said it like a benediction that had been pre-approved by common sense. Her eyes flicked to me and away like a bell that wanted to ring but had been told it couldn't. No one knew the private side of him. No one wanted to. They preferred the public man, the one who donated, smiled, queued up at community events. He had been careful, he had been charming, he had been the kind of person who provided good references. My version of him felt abrasive and unstable only in the intimate hours when the lights were low and the bills laid flat on the kitchen table. In public, he was blandly heroic. In public, he was impeccable. They painted me with thin brushes. I was emotional, reactive, unreliable. Friends that had once offered dinners brought casseroles with a distance, or they sent a text and waited for reply with the same patience one might give a stranger on a slow line. A few who had been close had the kind of eyes that hold the thought, "I don't want to pick a side." It was easier to distance than to engage. It was safer. Meanwhile, his machine moved in quiet increments. Accounts were frozen. A joint credit card had its limit reduced. The company we had once relied on for family vacations suddenly sent a letter of scheduling conflicts. Small administrative phrases that spoke loudly about who controlled what. He called these temporary measures and safeguards. He portrayed himself as careful. He spun his moves into a narrative of care, and it stuck to him like a brand. The pain of losing not just his affection but the protective layer of community is underappreciated. When the world turns its head because it believes a piece of paper, you feel foolish for ever believing in people who present smiles. You feel exposed. You feel smaller. Then there were the messages, the texts that appeared like fingerprints on glass. He scheduled meetings, and suddenly our shared calendar showed blocks marked work off-site. He told people we were taking time to reassess things and stitched a quilt of euphemisms that kept the truth stitched into silence. I would call and hear voicemail after voicemail. Polite, efficient, "I'm with clients, call back later." My voice became less and less urgent to people who had been loud friends. I kept a notebook in my bedside drawer, the same kind of notebook teenagers use for their angsty lists. I began to sketch timelines, small entries. June 3rd, transfer to account X, July 12th. Late night call, 11:42 p.m. July 21st, a neighbor saw him at 9:30 p.m. I drew lines with a ruler. I underlined phrases. I forced the world into boxes because my mind needed geometry to fight chaos. At work, acquaintances offered niceties with a pause that read like judgment. "We heard about the situation. Hope everything is okay." Their words felt like umbrellas opened in rain you already knew would pass. I started to keep my head down. I stopped inviting people for coffee. My phone's contact list became a place of ghosts. Names with no messages and reasons I couldn't be bothered to scroll into. He was good at the performance. In interviews, he'd use phrases that sounded paternal, compassionate, private. He was the man who would say, "Family comes first" on a camera and have people nod with approval. My reality was a contradiction to that image. He had a way of sliding back into charm at inopportune times that made people forgive and forget. It infuriated me. It made me feel small. It made me want to find a higher, quieter kind of justice. Short sentences. I wanted justice. The gaslighting cut through hours in private and minutes in public. He would contradict a fact that I knew to be true. He would tell me I misremembered. He would insist I had said things I never said. He would call my concerns paranoid in front of other people. When you hear that enough, you start to doubt the scaffolding of memory. You begin to believe complex alterations of what happened. You begin to ask, did I say that? Did I react the way I thought? Memory becomes slippery. At a town meeting, he stood beside a colleague and laughed at a joke, and someone from our social circle later said, he seemed so composed. The person said it like an observation of weather. I swallowed. I wanted to pull down the sky and show the weather underneath. The storms in his sentences at home, the nights he left the bathroom light on until dawn. But the world isn't a stage for private tempests. The public sees what is presented, and he had the good grace of presentation. There were small, painful betrayals that kept arriving like bills. One evening, I tried to buy school supplies, and the card declined. I called, and the bank told me there'd been a change to the account with an administrative block placed for review. I remembered the small transfer months before and felt the floor tilt. Another day, an email arrived from a client who said he had been relieved to hear about our family matters and needed to reassign our ongoing contracts. Work slipped. Money evaporated in ways that felt designed. He tightened the screws. He restricted communication. He made it harder for me to get legal counsel by threatening to drag the process on. He filed affidavits that included phrases designed to be alarming. Impulsive behavior, lack of stable environment. He painted my anger as instability. He framed my pushback as evidence that I couldn't cope. He turned normal defense into a symptom. Short sentence, it worked. There was a moment, one gray afternoon, where everything felt like an accumulation of small stones in a pocket. I had an appointment with a counselor who asked gentle questions and wrote in a notebook with a pen that squeaked. I walked out of her office and felt the outside light too bright. People passed with shopping bags and lives to maintain. A woman I'd known only from the school drive-thru leaned out of her car and called, "Are you okay?" She said it with the thin politeness of someone who'd seen a headline. I almost wanted to tell her everything. The emails, the tapes I didn't know if I could trust, the days that felt like colleges of small humiliations. I almost wanted to say, he lied. He lied about bank accounts and late dinners. He took things from me. Instead, I said, I'm fine, thank you. It was easier. It was safer. But the story builds its momentum in quiet places. The quieter he was on the surface, the more the machinery moved beneath. He would make a phone call that rerouted a client. He would schedule a meeting that replaced a day where I might have had leverage. He would be in the background of a charity photo, arm around a colleague, and the caption would read, "Community Leader." The caption made everyone breathe a little easier on his behalf. 3 weeks into the filing, something small and odd happened. A parcel arrived at our house with no return address. Inside was a folder. I had learned by then to treat mail like evidence. I opened it with the care of someone who might touch a fragile bone. Inside were printed emails, threads that showed him communicating with someone about scheduling and finances. Nothing overt, nothing damning on their face, but between the lines were inconsistencies, times that didn't align with our calendar, references to meeting at 11 when I had asked him about plans for that morning and been told there were none. It smelled of office paper and a faint hint of coffee. I felt the old tug of hope. If there were inconsistencies, maybe there was a pattern. I took them to my lawyer. She sat, reading, a slow nod, then a soft, "This could matter." The words warmed me like a single light in a long corridor. For the first time in months, I let myself imagine pushing back, but even as plans were made, small forces resisted. A witness I thought supportive pulled away after receiving a polite-sounding call. A colleague who had offered an email of support was suddenly described as misinformed. He had a way of talking people down. He had a way of making withdrawal feel like kindness. Then, near the end of that week, a tiny, bright thing happened. Mia came home with her hoodie zipped, hair raining down her shoulders, eyes careful. She set her backpack down and slid a scrap of paper across the table. On it were 2 words. I know. She didn't look up at me. She didn't have to. The words landed like a pebble in a quiet pond, and the rings spread. I asked her what she meant. She shrugged, then said, as if listing groceries, "He said things at 9:12. I recorded it. I saved the files." Her voice was even. Her mouth was tight. She had the look of someone who had practiced this admission and found it fit. My heart stopped. Then it began rambling. "Where?" I asked, too quick. "In my folder, on the drive, the one taped under my pencil case." She pointed to the same place where I had found that small flash drive weeks before. She had been quiet about it because she was protecting me. Because she was making a choice I hadn't asked her to make. A cliffhanger. The kind that tastes like a coin in your mouth. The kind that promises either rescue or ruin. I looked at her, she looked back. There was a gravity between us that had not been there before. The battle lines were not only legal now, they were moral, familial, private. He was moving pieces across a board I had thought we both controlled. She had been playing an entirely different game and had been, by the time I noticed, a few moves ahead. The files on that drive could be everything or nothing. They could show the cracks in his performance, or they could be edited echoes that meant little in court. They could be the thing that made the judge pause. They could be the thing that made him look small in a room where he'd always been large. They could also be the thing he used to claim entrapment. They could set off a chain of responses I could not yet predict. Short sentence, we didn't know. And so the chapter closed, not with an answer, but with a plan forming, spooling like thread. We were not yet ready to pull any taut strings. We watched. We collected. We kept our little evidences like coins in a jar, counting them at night, seeing if the total would buy us the truth. The world outside kept believing him. The lawyers kept filing. The neighborhood continued to offer cautious compassion. But inside, in the quiet of the kitchen, in the glow of the laptop, the tiny drive hummed with promise. I remember the moment like a physical thing, a pressure in my chest that pushed my ribs outward until I couldn't breathe normally. The judge's words landed like a coin on a table and kept rolling, making me chase them around a room I could not control. He described me in phrases that sounded clinical and untrue. Emotional instability, he said, as if reading from a weather report that had nothing to do with me. The courtroom air tasted metallic. My hands trembled, my throat tightened. I felt suddenly very small under the wide, impartial gaze of the bench. I crumpled. I promised. Never again. Short sentence. It hit me quick. There was an ache that felt like someone had put their hand on my sternum and squeezed to see if anything would crack. The gallery rustled. Faces that had been polite and neutral now had the faint crease of judgment. My ex sat with the mask of composure people had taught him to wear. His lawyer folded and unfolded papers like a metronome. The clerk called names, and the sound of shoes in the aisle measured the seconds of my life into a rhythm that belonged to someone else. Inside, the voice that had once whispered doubts now roared. How could this be happening? How had our private life become a courtroom exhibit where I was the uncertain character to be managed? For a moment, all I could feel was a tidal aftermath of humiliation and disbelief. I wanted to shout. I wanted to pull the rug out and watch the neat picture of his life fall apart. But the room was rule-bound. Language mattered. My anger would have to be careful. Anger sharpened into something other than heat. It folded into calculation. I felt a cold clarity bloom beneath the humiliation. If he was going to weaponize perception, I would weaponize proof. If he could reframe me with a single letter, I could reframe him with a pattern. If he could claim the narrative, I could reclaim it. The thing about those turning points is how precise they feel afterwards. You can point to the hour and say, "That was then." My hands had steadied by the time we left the room. My voice had become a tool I could measure. I stopped apologizing for being tired. I stopped explaining emotions away. I made a list. I wrote on the back of an envelope in block letters, evidence. Then I added subheadings, receipts, dates, messages, witnesses. The list felt crude, but It made the impossible feel possible. I started small. Night after night, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and a stack of paper. There were late nights that tasted like stale coffee and the glow of a screen, the hum quiet and constant, as if the machine were breathing with me. I set a playlist of ambient tracks low and let the rhythm drive my hands. Fingers moved over keys. Scanners rattled. I learned how to convert an email into a printable, to preserve a metadata line, to label files with exact dates. I learned how to make the ephemeral feel permanent. I replayed conversations in my head with the same exacting attention I once reserved for recipes. I recreated the rooms in my memory. Which bulb was flickering that night, which chair creaked when he sat, whether the kettle had left a ring on the counter. These were small things, but they helped me anchor memories in time, little geographic markers for truth. Memory is messy by design. I learned to make it a map. I kept a folder on my laptop titled Mia and Me. Inside, I stored voicemails, screenshots, a transcript of a tense phone call, copies of receipts that didn't add up. I broke my days into cells, dates, and times. It felt like building a mosaic from kitchen tiles, tedious, repetitive, but cumulative. I started printing everything and sliding it into labeled envelopes. The house smelled of ink and paper and the faint residue of cold coffee. The hum of the laptop became a companion, a mechanical, reassuring presence that let me work until my eyes stung. Allies appeared like lifelines. Not all of them came with fanfare. A teacher from Mia's school, Mrs. Anders, slid a note into my inbox that said she'd noticed changes in Mia's demeanor and would be willing to speak to the court if needed. She had a posture of quiet competence and a way of listening that made me feel seen. A friend, Layla, who had been a neighbor before she was a lawyer, came over one evening with a thermos and a look that said she had already decided where she stood. "You don't have to do this alone," she said, sliding onto the kitchen chair as if she were knocking on a door she knew would open. She brought a small stack of legal pads and a list of contacts. She offered to sit in meetings, to be a buffer, to read affidavits. She smelled like citrus and determination. Then, because we were in a world of complicated things, I found a private investigator. He was a middle-aged man with a soft jacket and a sharper mind. He listened without judgment, then said practical things about corroboration, how to get phone records held, how to document times, how to confirm a location without revealing sources. He taught me how to ask for what I needed without sounding hysterical. He brought me a kind of reassurance that was not sentimental but concrete. He was expensive, yes, and protocol-heavy, but he also understood the legal choreography. When you are being painted as unstable, a composed, methodical voice matters. There were nights when I wanted to throw all of it away and crawl back into bed. The internal monologue at those times was a chorus of fracturing voices, fear, doubt, rage, the small persistence that sweeps things into order. I would sit up, breath caught in my chest, hands hovering over the keyboard like a pianist about to play a piece that could break or mend everything. I replayed his small dismissals. I would write them down in quotation marks as if that made them ring truer. It's nothing. You're imagining it. I'm handling things. The repetition turned them into evidence of pattern, the same sentence appearing in different rooms. Mia was my north. She watched me with an attention that was both adolescent and ancient. Sometimes she made a face that said she was worried. Sometimes she would leave folded notes on the counter with a heart and a message. "You got this, Mom." And the childishness of it gave me strength. I did not want her to be dragged through the public gutter. I wanted to make her safety the axis of everything. She started recording then more deliberately. It was not an act of cunning so much as habit. She had always saved things, the receipts from first concerts, messages from friends that made her laugh, little voice memos where she practiced speeches for class. But now, she collected differently. She saved snippets of his voice, messages that flickered like a faulty lamp. She took screenshots and labeled them. She wrote down times and dates in the small spiral notebook she kept under her mattress. At first I had not asked. I had not told her to become an archivist. She simply looked at me one evening, brows knit, and said, "Maybe this will help." She said it with a matter-of-factness that made my throat tighten. We had a conversation in the dark of her room one night that is still with me. The two of us under the thin light of a lamp, a map of small things spread between us like breadcrumbs. She handed me a collection of audio files on the flash drive and watched me with steady eyes. "If you say yes," she said quietly, "I'll stand with you." Her voice was steady. Her hand found mine like a practiced motion. We held it together and fit fingers into the same place as if to brace each other. For a beat, I let myself be ordinary. No courtrooms, no lawyers, no strategic calculations, just a mother and daughter holding hands. Her knuckles were calloused in the way teenagers are from gripping skateboards and pens and practices. They were small and fierce. We made a pact without dramatics. We did not rehearse speeches. We did not write manifestos. We sat with a stack of audio files and a list of dates and plans. She told me about the times she had recorded, not to entrap, she said, but because she liked to keep things that mattered. She admitted she'd been embarrassed sometimes by the things she had captured, his jokes, his off-key humming, the quiet way his voice changed when he thought no one was listening. But there were moments, too, where it slipped, conversations that hinted at something else. She had saved them because she felt the little prick of wrongness in her chest, and she didn't want to be the only one who felt it. I remember thinking, as we strategized, how odd it felt to plan with the crispness of detectives. We laid out 3 possible paths. We could use the files to impeach his credibility, to show a pattern of contradictory statements. We could submit them as part of a larger pile of evidence, receipts, emails, witness statements, or we could attempt to leverage them for a negotiated settlement that would protect Mia's schooling, our home, and my finances. The options felt both baroque and brutally simple. There were nights I felt like I was building a fortress out of paper and pixels. The physical act of organizing files kept panic at bay. I made folders. I labeled them clearly. Audio 1, date, location, email chain, payment, account X. Clarity was a small weapon. I found myself asking the practical questions. Would the court accept these files? Were the timestamps intact? Did the files have metadata? Could they be authenticated? The investigator taught me how to capture that context. Screenshots of file properties, backups, copies stored in cloud folders monitored by others. He showed me how to make the ephemeral cling to the permanent. In the midst of the planning, there were moments of bewildering tenderness. Layla stayed late one night to help me draft an affidavit. She poured coffee and frowned at my first attempt and then rewrote it with the directness of someone who didn't have patience for dramatics. "Say the truth simply," she said, "and the truth will be louder than their adjectives." Mia came downstairs and made us all ridiculous grilled cheeses at midnight, the 2 of us laughing like conspirators about nothing in particular to diffuse the tension. Those small acts, the sandwich, the thermos, the lamp left on in the kitchen, became scaffolding. Then there were small setbacks that felt enormous. A witness who had been willing to speak changed her mind after a polite call from an unknown number. An email that I had thought would corroborate a date went missing from a thread and left me scraping other evidence like an attic rummage. My internal monologue spun like a hamster wheel, running through permutations. What if the judge dismisses it? What if the files are deemed inadmissible? What if this makes everything worse? Fear is a constant companion in this phase, but it is also a teacher. It taught me to be meticulous and to anticipate maneuvering. It taught me to cultivate patience in a way I had not known. It taught me to be precise in language and careful in presentation. Where I had once emoted, I now documented. As the date for the preliminary hearing approached, we tightened the plan. We would not ambush. We would be methodical. We would present pattern instead of drama. We would allow the judge to see a sequence unfold, times, contradictions, and a steady line that suggested more than a few isolated incidents. We would not theatrically collapse. We would quietly show that the man standing across the room was not merely charming in public, but inconsistent in private, and that those inconsistencies affected the safety and stability of our child. We rehearsed the logistics. Mia practiced handing the device into my care and then delivering it as instructed. She practiced holding the remote with the composure of someone delivering a lesson. We practiced the cadence of a calm exchange where she would not be the star but the witness. We planned for objections. We prepared authenticity backups. We met with the investigator who confirmed chain of custody steps and went with us to the office to log the files. On the night before the hearing, I sat on the edge of my bed and watched Mia as she packed her backpack for school with a song under her breath. I thought of all the ways we'd been small and brave and ordinary. I thought of how close the edges of life could be. My internal voice quieted, and what remained was simple and fierce. We had one chance. We had one video. The work began like a ritual, small, repetitive, physical acts that accumulated into armor. I built a workspace on the kitchen table, a lamp with a soft golden bulb, a stack of manila folders, a mug that never emptied of black coffee, and the laptop whose screen became a map of every hour of my life. The house felt different while I was doing it. The ordinary domestic hum, dishwasher in the background, the fridge humming, the muffled TV from the neighbor's apartment retreated into a thin wall so that every click of the keyboard sounded loud and deliberate. Assembling proof was tactile. I handled paper like a conservator. I treated emails like artifacts. The rustle of paper became a metronome for purpose. I printed timestamps, copied files, exported message headers, and made sure each file had a name that would not embarrass me later. Date, time, subject, so that no one could accuse me of sloppy memory. I learned to right-click and choose properties to reveal the metadata that quietly proved where and when a file had been created. I learned to screenshot context, the whole thread, not just the bit that fit the narrative I wanted. Details mattered. Metadata mattered more. I remember the smell of the ink, the warm curl of freshly printed pages, the slight adhesive cling from the label maker when I pressed a sticker onto a folder. The glow of the laptop at night was a steady friend. I worked with the determination of someone cataloging a lost room. Each PDF I made, each certificate I saved to multiple drives felt like a small victory. The investigator taught me to duplicate everything. Redundancy is your friend, he said in that quiet way men with experience have, leaning close so his whisper could be treated like a directive. This will stand up. He tapped the file on his tablet like it was a passport. We recreated events with obsessive care. If a text said 9:12 p.m., we checked call logs, the carrier history, any photos with timestamps on that night. We cross-referenced dinner reservations, gas receipts, calendar entries. It felt like assembling a jigsaw puzzle where every piece had to match the grain of wood in the table. Sometimes the pieces fit easily, an email here, a receipt there. Other times they resisted, as if memory had been smudged on purpose. We interviewed witnesses the old-fashioned way, quietly in kitchens and coffee shops, over pastries and late-night phone calls. People were wary. I learned to make it easy for them. No pressure. An offer of confidentiality, a promise to copy what they gave me and return the originals. Teachers, a neighbor who noticed different arrivals and departures, a barista who remembered a lunch where he'd been distracted. These small voices stitched together a pattern. The investigator, whom Mia liked for his ready smile and the way he treated her like someone important rather than a nuisance, sat with me while I labeled a binder. Chronology. He showed me how to insert a chain of custody note, who handled the device when it was moved, who backed it up, and where. Courts don't like gaps, he murmured, tapping the pen against the page. Gaps invite doubt. Close the gaps. He taught me to make copies and place them in places I could not forget. A locked safe, a cloud folder with two-factor authentication, an email to a neutral account so the timestamp itself could be part of the record. I set alarms for backups. I told myself the alarms were the heartbeat of a plan. At night, I would replay conversations I'd once shrugged off. I typed them into a document as if transcription could anchor truth. The exact cadence of his deflections, the pause, before he lied, the small laugh that punctuated an evasive phrase. Typing made it steadier. I printed the transcripts and highlighted the contradictions. It was tedious work. It was necessary work. We began to shape a courtroom narrative. This was not theater. We would not amplify emotions for spectacle. We would make a sober case built from accretion. My lawyer, sharp, exacting, the opposite of melodrama, sat across from me with a legal pad and a discipline that felt like a shield. "We don't dramatize, we prove," she said at our first real strategy session, voice calm, pen poised. The sentence landed with relief. I liked that sentence. It gave me a posture. She told me how the evidence would be presented. Pattern, not isolated incidents. Corroboration, not accusation. Chain of custody, not hearsay. Everything had to serve the narrative of reliability. We would show repeated inconsistencies, dates, times, statements that shifted with audience and advantage. We would let the judge see the same tune played in different rooms until the melody itself became undeniable. "If you can establish a sequence," she said, eyes steady, "the judge won't need to be dramatic about it. The sequence will speak." We rehearsed logistics. The video needed to be more than emotion. It had to be authenticated. My lawyer walked me through the admissibility hurdles with the patience of someone teaching a delicate instrument. We discussed whether to submit files pre-hearing or to use them in a live demonstration. We considered chain of custody affidavits, witness statements from those who could verify the times and contexts of recordings, and the technical steps to show the files had not been tampered with. She explained hearsay exceptions, authentication through witnesses who could attest to the recording process, and the necessity of backups in multiple locations. It was a lot of words that sounded arcane, but with each explanation, the plan gained shape. Mock dialogues and dry runs became part of the process. We practiced handing exhibits to the court clerk. We rehearsed a scenario where an opposing counsel objected, and my attorney calmly explained the foundation. "Objection, Your Honor." "On what grounds?" she'd ask, and then she'd lay out the chain. Who recorded, where, how it was stored, who had access. She emphasized the difference between accusation and documentation. "We don't dramatize, we prove." That line was our anchor. It kept us from theatricality and misstep. Building the video itself was a slow, careful excavation. Mia and I sat on the living room floor with her headphones and my laptop like detectives in a field tent. The device she'd brought, the small flash drive taped to the pencil case, contained hundreds of tiny files, voice memos, a clip of a voicemail, a shaky video where he muttered an explanation about protecting reputations, and screenshots of messages that contradicted the man he was in public. It was raw. It was private. It was perfect for the case we needed to make. We didn't want to show everything. That was a tempting trap. Oversharing could seem like spectacle. Instead, we curated. We selected clips that, when strung together, revealed pattern, a voice admitting one thing to an unnamed listener, a later message denying it, a casual joke at dinner that became a private threat in a voicemail, a meeting scheduled that contradicted his stated whereabouts. We layered them with dates and context, short captions that indicated time, location, and the thread of relevance. I wanted the judge to feel the texture, not the melodrama. I wanted the sequence to be undeniable. Editing was an emotional minefield. We watched bits of him that made my chest ache. Times he sounded tired and honest. Moments where his voice softened. Snippets of laughter that, in hindsight, were camouflage for something else. Mia sat beside me, jaw set, sometimes humming to steady herself. "Too long?" she would ask, and I would nod. We trimmed for force. We didn't want to humiliate. We wanted clarity. There were sensory details I remember with a sharpness that surprises me. The click of the mouse when I hit save, the soft whir of the laptop fan, the way Mia's small hand trembled the first time she held the phone that had recorded her father. I put my hand over hers, not to steady the device, but to steady the human on the other end of it. The emotional cost of reliving betrayal was real. We both paid it. The editing process forced us to watch him not as a person I loved once, but as evidence of a pattern that endangered us. I learned to separate feeling from function. And then the obstacles arrived like weather. The first was technical, a file corrupted during transfer. I remember the sick feeling, the laptop screen displaying an icon that meant loss, the small digital graveyard of corrupted clips. "The file was gone," I told the investigator, voice flat. He leaned forward, fingers working through commands like a third hand. For a heartbeat, I imagined everything collapsing. Then he smiled in a way that was not triumphal, but procedural. "We have backups," he said. He led me to another folder, buried in a different drive, time-stamped and intact. Relief was an immediate physical thing. My shoulders dropped an inch. Breath left me in a ragged laugh. We had redundancy for a reason. The legal opposition tried their own maneuvers. An email from him's counsel arrived, curt and precise, hinting at entrapment and suggesting our collection methods were suspect. They questioned authenticity and raised the specter of bad faith. For a night, I lay awake drafting responses with my lawyer, imagining the courtroom where they would stand and say the files were manipulated. My lawyer, always the steady center, reminded me that authentication meant showing origin and chain of custody. That's what we had built. "They will object," she said. "We'll be ready to show foundation." A witness we thought would corroborate a time and place reconsidered after an anonymous call. She emailed to say she needed distance. My heart clenched. Then another person stepped forward who had been quietly watching from the edges, someone who'd noticed patterns but had feared being entangled. People moved. Fear moved. I learned to rally the ones who could be rallied and to accept that some would fall away. At one point, a subpoena arrived demanding the raw files be turned over early in discovery. Panic flared. If they had access, they could raise objections or plant doubt in public forums. We consulted and chose to provide copies under strict protective orders and to place copies in escrow with the court clerk where the chain of custody could be documented. The procedural decisions felt like chess. Sometimes you give a pawn to save a bishop. We negotiated the terms with a carefulness that bordered on ritual, short sentences. We had to be surgical. There was a night I almost broke. A news tipster reached out, promising to look into this in exchange for an interview. I imagined his face in a headline, our privacy turned into column inches. "Don't," Mia whispered, her voice small but absolute. I thought of the moment we needed to control. Not the moment when the world rushed in, but the one we would take to a judge. We refused the outside noise. We kept our cadence. The day before the hearing, we ran through everything. My lawyer and the investigator met us at the office for a dress rehearsal. We practiced showing the judge how the sequence would unfold, the order of exhibits, how Mia would hand the device to the clerk, how the video would be played, and how witnesses would be called to authenticate. We spoke in short, purposeful sentences in the office, and it felt less like a rehearsal and more like a deployment. The investigator printed a chain of custody form and signed it in my presence. He placed a copy in a sealed envelope for the court file. The physical act of signing something felt like making a promise to the future. We had contingency plans. What if their counsel objected to the video? We had a witness who could testify to its creation. What if the playback failed? We had multiple formats and a technician on standby. What if the judge dismissed it as irrelevant? We prepared the chronology that tied each clip to events that mattered to custody and safety. Each contingency required paperwork, and each piece of paper required a witness and a timestamp. We were building scaffolding. On the last night, before the big day, there was a fragile domestic moment that felt like a gift. Mia and I sat on the couch and watched an old movie, not to escape, but to remind ourselves of the ordinary things still alive in us. We ate popcorn from a bowl that had a chip on the rim, the same bowl we'd used for years, and we talked about nothing important. The color of leaves, the teacher who made algebra fun. Those small neutralities felt like a battery. They gave us a reserve of calm. Before bed, we ran through breathing exercises my lawyer had suggested to keep nerves steady. Inhale for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 6. We practiced together, laughing at the absurdity of breathing like actors. I took Mia's hand and felt the small bones. We squeezed each other's fingers and promised a plan. Truth, sequence order. Nothing theatrical, nothing vengeful, just the truth arranged so it could not be dismissed. If they try to silence you, speak anyway, I told her. The line was almost a dare and a benediction. She nodded, sleepy but resolute. I kissed the top of her head and tucked her in. The house hummed like a held breath. In the morning, on the way to court, we were quiet. The city moved around us. People with umbrellas, a dog that barked somewhere. the usual clamor of life. We walked slow. Mia's hand fit in mine like it always had, and it felt like a small, stubborn anchor. As we reached the courthouse steps, the sun slid across the stone like a promise. I felt the plan settle in my bones. The evidence sat in a neat stack, digital and physical, labeled and backed up. The video was cued, the chain of custody was signed, the witnesses knew their roles. The legal path was mapped. We had rehearsed the moment until the choreography felt natural. We had built redundancy until there was nowhere for the truth to slip away. The rest would be performance under rules, not the chaos of rumor. We stepped up the courthouse steps together as if stepping into a scene we had practiced until it had become a ritual of honesty. The exterior of the courthouse was cool and impassive. The brass handles of the doors shone with fingerprints of countless hands that had been there before us. We paused on the steps and Mia looked at me, bright-eyed in the way young people look when they are waiting to see if the world will make sense. I tightened my grip on her hand, breathed in steady, and thought about the months of printing and copying, the nights of stale coffee and the investigator's quiet confidence, the small acts of bravery from people who stepped forward. We had one chance. We had one video. All rise. The words felt ceremonial and small, like a bell. The courtroom stood and the sound of shoes on wood filled the space in neat, practiced waves. The air there had the peculiar hush of places where people speak in rules. The varnished wood smelled faintly of polish and history. The judge's robe hung dark and authoritative like a curtain. Camera lenses glinted at the back of the room, patient and watchful. My heartbeat was a drum in my throat. It had a tempo I could count on, 1, 2, 1, 2, steady enough to keep me upright. Mia's hand was small in mine. Her fingers were warm and a little sweaty. She had been chewing the edge of her thumbnail, and now she didn't. She tucked her thumb under my hand like a talisman. She was 15 and brave and exhausted, in a way that looked older than her years. I watched the movement of her shoulders, the way she breathed shallow and then deeper, matching the breath we had practiced. The world outside the courtroom felt far. Here, sounds were nearer, sharper. The clerk's voice read names. The judge's pen made soft ink scratches. A whisper from our counsel. You ready? Short sentence, yes. Someone beside me coughed. The sound was unexpected and intimate amid the formality, like a reminder that real people sat in real bodies. My lawyer nudged my elbow. The opposing counsel adjusted his tie with a careful, practiced motion and smiled the kind of smile that belongs in magazine portraits. My ex sat with the composed posture he had practiced in public, a slight tilt of the head, a calm like a curtain. He looked JP, the man the world wanted, polished, steady. I remembered how easy it had been for him to step into that costume. When she pressed play, the room inhaled. When she pressed play, the world narrowed to a rectangle of light. A click, a thin sound that should have been ordinary. It landed like a strike. The video began. The first frame was grainy, a kitchen table lit by the tired glow of an evening lamp. His voice came into the room, familiar and ordinary. It sounded different when it was recorded. There was a casualness in the way he spoke that, played back, sounded like an admission. The clip moved into a voicemail where his tone frayed. A line about handling things sounded less like stewardship and more like concealment. Another clip, text messages tiled across the screen, fell into place, statements that contradicted the ones he'd made in interviews and declarations. A bank notice overlain on the next frame matched an earlier email with a date that did not line up with his calendar entries. The sequence stitched together into something coherent and unavoidable. Time folded in a way that made every small lie flat and visible. Frame by frame, the room watched him become a different man. His confident color drained. His confident color bled away as if someone had lifted the paint. His voice found a new, shaky register. He fumbled a word that should have been easy. The judge's pen stilled. People breathed out like a collective response. A whisper rose, not loud, but like a wind across thin grass. A murmur swelled. Someone in the gallery said, "Oh." Another voice made a soft sound like paper being folded. The opposing counsel shifted, and the practiced smile hardened into a line. His hands, those steady hands, folded into each other and then opened again like someone realizing he needed to act. He rose to object, lips moving in the motion of protocol. "Objection," he said, smooth. "Foundation." My lawyer did not flinch. She stood, the quiet force of someone who knew the choreography. "We have authentication," she replied, voice clear. "Chain of custody is documented. The files are originals. We offer them for their probative value." Her words were small and precise, like tools. The judge leaned forward. A single little movement, the courtroom bent with him. Time folded again. Time folded and let the sequence speak. The sound in the room felt like slow rain. Eyes darted. A juror, if there had been one, would have noted the change of posture in a heartbeat. The ex's jaw worked. He reached for a glass of water and then set it down as if its contact with the table would betray him. He tried to speak, and the judge's gavel rested in quiet authority. No theatrical collapse, no dramatic outburst. Just the unraveling of a performance under the terrible light of evidence. Witnesses exchanged looks that were not planned. Some nodded minutely, as if surprised at the clarity of something they suspected but could not name. A woman who had sat upright the whole morning slouched, as if the weight of seeing confirmation had exhausted her. The investigator I'd paid months for crossed his arms, the satisfaction in his posture discreet, professional. He had told me this could matter. Now the matter mattered loudly. The opposing lawyer's posture crumbled in ways that were small but telling. Hands unclenched, tie loosened, a set of shoulders lost its practiced lift. He opened his mouth twice and closed it twice, searching for an argument he could make without sounding mendacious. The judge held the room with a look that was not triumph, not pleasure, only a slow registering of fact. The murmurs swelled and then softened like waves hitting a shore and receding. I felt light and heavy, both. The rush of relief was immediate and strange, like stepping out of water. There was relief because something true, painful, and intimate had finally been seen by impartial eyes. There was also the weight of consequences, of a life reconstructed in public panels and transcripts, of his face now mapped by a string of moments he could not stitch back together. My shoulders lowered an inch as if releasing a strap. Tears came, quiet, hot, retracing months of fear. I did not reach for them. I let them do their work. When the video ended, there was a silence the length of a held breath. The judge closed his folder and rubbed his eyes slowly, not in fatigue, but in a gesture that marked the end of an act of seeing. He did not yet rule. He did not need to. The sequence had done what words could not. It had made a story simple by showing it over and over, by letting pattern speak where accusation might have been dismissed as spite. The immediate fallout felt both petty and enormous. Phones began to buzz against thighs like small insects. My messaging thread lit up with messages from numbers that had been quiet for months, friends who had seen the segment of reality and decided to step forward. "I'm so sorry," one text read. "I always wondered," wrote another. There were calls from people we used to know who asked for explanation with a voice that trembled, either with sympathy or with the awkwardness of being implicated in previous blindness. Outside the courthouse, the press circled with their microphones like birds. A reporter's camera angled in ways that flattened the world. The ex's public profile, once glossy, found edges where shadow crept in. Clients who had once spoken favorably in his name began using the language of distancing. "We are reviewing our relationship." A nonprofit removed his headshot from their site with a quiet note about changes. The machinery of reputation is a fragile thing. It has the speed of rumor and the weight of legal consequence. It began to tilt. Lawyers whispered in doorways. Colleagues who had once lauded him made statements that were careful and formal. The office where he once sat in photos began to issue statements about internal reviews. It was not immediate annihilation. This was not a spectacle to behold. Consequences are slower. They are the drip of water that wears stone. But the drip had begun. I thought about what victory meant in that moment. It was not about watching him fall into ruin. It was not about relishing his discomfort. It was about the small, practical things. Mia's right to a life without constant strategic gaslighting, our ability to stay in the house without financial fear, the chance for normal dinners, the quiet of afternoons where I did not have to question every tone. That was the real prize: safety, dignity, stability. I had wanted all along less the spectacle and more the possibility of ordinary days. Murmurs continued as people stood and filed out. Some faces avoided mine. Others lingered and offered eyes that held apology or relief or little else. Mia squeezed my hand, contact that felt like an anchor. I looked at her and saw a tiredness smoothed into resolve. She had been part of the work. She had seen the world shift and had learned the heavy cost of truth. I felt proud and exhausted and careful about what the next days would ask of her. We walked out of the courthouse slow. The late light made the stone steps softer. Cameras flashed in irregular beats. People asked questions. We offered no answers beyond a short statement practiced with my lawyer. Truth, process, privacy. There would be calls from editors, from acquaintances who needed to locate the version of events they had believed. There would be people who tried to turn our pain into headlines. We had prepared for that too. Boundaries, a request for privacy, a measured statement. In the days that followed, small things shifted in ways that were both immediate and gradual. A client withdrew an engagement with him. A mutual friend sent a note, faint and apologetic, from which you could trace the exact sentence of changed allegiance. The ex's calendar populated with fewer public events. The brand of him that people had liked began to wear thinner because the seams were now visible. But there were gentler consequences, too. Former friends reached out with notes that said simply, "I'm sorry, I didn't see." A teacher called to say, "Mia is stronger than most adults I know." My inbox filled with messages from strangers who had been backstabbed and wanted to say they believed us. Those small confirmations felt like stitches in a wound. Short sentence. It was not the end. It was a pivot. The most lasting change was quieter. At home, Mia unpacked her backpack and left the small notebook on the table. The house smelled of dinner and detergent and something steadier. Normalcy in the making. I sat at the kitchen table and pressed my palms flat on the oak and breathed in the particular smell of the room that had held so many plans. The fight had been public, in part. The recovery would be private and slower. That knowledge settled on me, not as exhaustion, but as an invitation to build again. We had forced a moment of truth into the light. The court had seen a sequence. The world had watched, and the architecture of his performance had been exposed. I had wanted justice, but what I received was more complex. Vindication braided with fatigue, relief threaded with sorrow. I folded both into a quiet resolve, to keep the small things that made our life human intact, to guard Mia's sleep, and to put the pieces back together in a way that made sense to us. When she pressed play, the room inhaled. Time folded. We were broken. We fought. We were heard. Saying that aloud feels strange, as if I'm giving a report of injuries and victories at once. The months before the courtroom were a collage of small betrayals and louder silences. Nights of stale coffee and filing, the soft rustle of paper like a slow heartbeat. Mia's voice memos tucked into a drive like talismans. The hearing did not flip a switch and make everything right. It pulled a curtain back and let light show the seams. That light did something quiet and practical. It made it harder for people to mistake his performance for truth. There's a difference between justice and revenge. I wanted the scales balanced, not a spectacle. I wanted protection for my child, not to see someone publicly humiliated for the sake of applause. The video changed the narrative. It didn't make me less tired. It made us safer in a way that allowed sleep to come back slowly. It brought dignity in small, practical measures. Fewer threatening calls. A calmer schedule for Mia. A space where we could step into ordinary afternoons without counting the cost of every sentence. The cost of exposure is real. Truth can cut both ways. There are friends who walked away, and there are reputations that will take time to mend. There are mornings when the kettle still seems a little too loud, and nights when I wake and check the house. But there are more mornings now where the noise is simply the radio, and Mia making coffee for breakfast like she does on Saturdays. Those small, reclaimed rituals feel like victory. What would you have done if the person you trusted had been twisting the story of your life? I ask that not to provoke, but to make you pause, because the hard choices were never about spectacle. They were about safety and about teaching a teenage girl that truth can be collected and used to protect the people you love. If this revenge saga gave you that rush of justice, smash like, subscribe for more epic tales, and share your revenge story in the comments. Click the next video box for another one. We walked away from the courthouse into washed afternoon light. The camera would hold that shot, two silhouettes moving down stone steps, and then turn its gaze somewhere kinder, somewhere private. We didn't win by hurting him. We won by refusing to be erased.